My name is Addison Petty. I'm a student in the Master of Urban and Regional Planning program at CU Denver, where I also work on campus in the Facility for Advanced Spatial Technology. And I'm really excited to welcome you to our next conversation today, which is innovative affordable housing strategies. And to get us started with that conversation today is Casey McPherson with the Department of Local Affairs.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the last session of the day. Just this and then reception. We're really excited to have you here and talk about some of the new programs that are coming to DOLA and affordable housing in general. We're going to try and keep it really interactive since it's our last session here today. So we're going to give some presentation, get some thoughts going, and then focus in on the Q&A, hear about what's going on in your communities, what your challenges are, and what your goals are, and maybe we can do some talking about how that might go. So generally, what we're going to cover is the House Bill 1271 overview, and Christy Wiseman's going to lead us through that and the planning grant program. Carrie Latimer is going to take us through the incentives grant program. And then I'm going to do the best I can to cover some slides that we got from our colleagues at the Division of Housing. I am not Spencer, so I will give you my best, but we're going to focus in on how might you think about what DOH has to offer, could those funds be leveraged, those kinds of questions. So we'll spend a little time there. And then a huge thank you to Erin Fosdick from Longmont for joining us. We wrangled her into this just a few days ago, so she's going to help ground us to think of, get your brains kick-started on, what are some communities out there doing, what's been effective, what's been hard, and so we'll have a little discussion of that before we go into our Q&A all together. So with that, I'll hand it over to Christy.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. So to start us off, show of hands, who has heard of 1271, the bill? Great, so a good number of you. So I'm going to give just an overview of the bill intent and then get into the planning grant program, which is one of the 3 programs created by the bill. So 1271 was passed this spring legislative session, and it really gets at the affordable housing issue from the local land use lens. So examining the policy and regulatory environment of local governments and really incentivizing and making it easier to develop affordable housing. So the grant programs are really designed with this goal in mind to create lasting change at the local level to make it easier to address some of those supply side issues you might have heard earlier in the sessions today. So the bill created 3 programs. We have the incentives grant program, which Carrie will cover. We have the planning grant program, which I will go into. And then we also have a housing toolkit program, which our Division of Housing is leading. We won't get into that too much, but if you have questions, we can direct you to Division of Housing staff contact information. And this is stimulus money, so one thing to note is that all funds must be spent by June 30th of 2024. So it's essentially a 3 fiscal year program. So eligible recipients, this is a program designed for local governments, so municipalities and counties. That was something that was specified in the bill language. So unfortunately, housing authorities, councils of governments, and other partners cannot apply on behalf of their local governments. The local governments themselves need to apply and to be the grantees. One thing to note is that federally recognized tribes, the 2 in Colorado, are eligible for the toolkit program under the Division of Housing. So what is affordable? We thought this would be good to put up at the beginning of the presentation. A lot of communities define this differently: affordable housing, attainable housing, workforce housing. Certainly you all have definitions in your codes that are relevant for your economic and demographic context, right? And that's within your power to define and regulate that as local governments. But for the purposes of this funding, affordable is defined in terms of AMI limits. So up to 80% AMI for rental housing and up to 140% for homeownership. And this is important to keep in mind when we talk about the incentives grant programs, because any projects that we fund through that program will need to meet these AMI limits. All right, so those of you familiar with the bill may have seen this list of qualifying policy and regulatory strategies. I really wish we had a catchier name for these. We just call them the qualifying list of strategies. True planning nerds will appreciate these. But these were listed in the bill, and this was really the bill sponsor's kind of menu of options for local governments to consider. So in order to qualify for the incentives grant program, which is essentially implementation money for an affordable housing project or program, communities need to have adopted at least 3 of these on the list. So these were kind of created through the legislative process. And I will note at the bottom there, the bill does give DOLA the power to consider what it calls other novel, creative, or innovative strategies that have the same lasting effect on incentivizing affordable housing development as other strategies in this list. So you might notice if you look at our program guidelines for the incentives grant program, one thing we did add to this list was an inclusionary zoning ordinance. And Aaron with Longmont will talk about theirs in a little bit, but communities do have the option when you're coming to us either for a planning grant or for an incentives grant to say, hey, we have a policy or we have a regulation that's not necessarily enumerated in this list, but we think it has the same effect and the same impact on housing development, so we do have the option to consider that. And as you can see also, this is kind of a mix of regulatory things, so things that you might find in your code, as well as more programmatic or policy decisions. So the expedited development review might be something that's not necessarily in your zoning code, but it's a formally kind of adopted policy that you as a department will make. And I'll just note too, these are abbreviated, so please read the bill language to see the actual verbiage of how these are described. All right, so you might be thinking, that's a great list, and what if our community doesn't necessarily have 3 of the things on that list? That's the purpose of the planning grant program. So the planning grant program is what it sounds like. It funds planning work, and again, the eligible entities are municipalities and counties, and we can fund regional collaborative applications, so keep this in mind. If you are a county and you want to partner with a town or partner with a city in your neighboring region to come in for a planning grant and do some regional streamlined work, you can do that as well. And we have $6.8 million to award for the planning grants. We don't have a set award maximum. We're thinking that we'll see applications in the range of 50,000 to 200,000, maybe a little bit more for really complex, multifaceted projects like multiple code updates and a housing needs assessment or things like that. There is a 25% local financial match, but I want to say on the match, we really don't want worries about the match to preclude any community from applying. So we're trying to be as flexible as possible with match. And if you are worried about not meeting that 25% match, we encourage you to reach out to us, reach out to your DOLA regional manager, and start that conversation. And we are anticipating that there will be match reductions and match waivers for communities, particularly some of the smaller and rural communities. We have a match in there because we want the communities that do have a really robust local housing partnership ecosystem that can pay the match to pay the match, because that helps us spread the money around and fund more communities. But certainly if you don't have the match, please don't let that stop you from coming in, and we can have that conversation. And then lastly, a note on planning grants. So planning grants cannot cover admin expenses, so it can't fund a position. It really has to fund the code updates from that qualifying list, and then any associated studies that help you make that lasting change. So in terms of eligible projects, getting into more detail of what it can fund, it basically funds the work to help communities to qualify for incentives grants, which is that implementation money. But I want to make it very clear in that you do not need to intend to come in for an incentives grant in order to apply and to be competitive for a planning grant. We want this program to meet its intent from the legislature, which is to make long-lasting change at the local level across Colorado, so that when these stimulus money is spent a few years from now, those lasting code changes will still pave the way and kind of help make it easier in the long run. So don't let the fact that you don't have a project in your pipeline that could use incentives money stop you from coming in for a planning grant. And we get a lot of questions about, we need to update our housing needs assessment, or we want to do a vacant property inventory, or we're really interested in studying a commercial linkage fee or a nexus to maybe develop a dedicated funding source for affordable housing. Those are all things that can be funded through the planning grant program, as long as the study is paired with one of the things from the list. We can't fund studies on their own because the study itself isn't making that long-lasting change. We really need to see how the results of the study and the policy direction that's coming out of that study, how that's going to be implemented. So keep that in mind when you're putting together your applications. The studies are great, but we want to see that tie of, okay, how is that going to be implemented in your codes and in your policies? And then I also want to point out that with all these programs, we really want to see equitable and inclusive public engagement processes. We expect our grantees to go kind of above and beyond in terms of holding public meetings, getting input, and really making sure that whatever strategies you're adopting, you're considering how they will impact marginalized and vulnerable populations, which are usually the populations that most will benefit from affordable housing development, right? So you absolutely can, and we encourage you to have a line item in your budget and use part of the award to fund that public engagement. And just so you know, we are working to come up with more specific guidance on kind of best practices and what we'd like to see for public engagement, and we'll be updating our FAQ document with that hopefully in the next week. And in terms of timeline, so we're talking about the planning grant first because it is open first. So applications are open now. They opened in early August, and they are in our DOLA grant portal. If you've ever applied for like an energy mineral impact grant, it's the same system. And so we're accepting planning grant applications on a rolling basis. So you can technically apply anytime, but what we're gonna do is go in on certain dates and pull all the applications received thus far, and those will kind of create our cohorts for the rounds. So the first deadline in which to make sure you're in the first round of review is September 20th. And then at that point, we'll go in, pull all the ones we've received, and make award decisions. And then depending how much money's left over, we'll have a second round with a due date late October and go from there until the funds are expended. I can't say for sure how many funding rounds there will be. That would be fun to take bets. It really depends on how many applications we receive. So we're really encouraging communities, if you can meet that September 20th date. It is essentially a first come, first served program. Obviously you have to meet the requirements and have a well thought out application, but we really encourage you to get those applications in because we know how long some of this planning work can take. Sometimes code updates can take some twists and turns along their journey to adoption. So we want to give communities enough time as we possibly can to do this planning work in order so they can qualify and then be ready when we open the incentives grant pool. And we'll talk about more about timeline for incentives grant in a minute. And then again, because this is a stimulus program, all funds must be spent by June 30th of 2024. So if you have questions about the planning grant, hold them, write them down, and then we're gonna have a big kind of Q&A about all the programs at the end. And I think now I will turn over to Carrie to talk about the incentives grants. Thanks.
Hey, okay, so I'm gonna run us through the second part of House Bill 1271, which is the incentives grant program. So this program is once you've adopted 3 of the strategies or you've come in for the planning grant and you've adopted 3 of the strategies and you qualify, this is the grant that you want to apply for. So it is the larger portion of money that was a part of the stimulus bill. It's $37.7 million for grants to also municipalities and counties to fund the just gap funding for all your affordable housing projects. So it can all run through what would be qualifying for this funding in a few slides, but it's for actually these ready-to-build projects. So as I just said, to qualify, you have to have adopted 3 of the qualifying strategies off that menu in the beginning of the presentation. And if you don't have the 3 strategies, apply to the planning grant program. The suggested award max that we are going off of is $3 million. We expect that the awarding for the projects will be from $500,000 to $1 million. But we also set the max at $3 million because we do want those really big, exciting projects, but we also want to incentivize geographic diversity and also help the smaller projects around the state. And we are looking for a 20% match required. This is no in kind, so, but we are recognizing that we will look for reduction and waiver for economic hardship. So so we're not taking like staff time as match, but we are looking for a cash match. Oh, and leveraging of other funds that exist across the state. So eligible projects. So what we're looking for with the Incentives Grant Program is gap funding for affordable housing development or to otherwise support affordable housing implementation. So this could range from infrastructure, tap fees, neighborhood or site amenities, or other investments like land acquisition, or to even create programs such as a housing land trust or other lasting land acquisition programs. We also are looking for this program to see a lot of really great inclusive and equitable public engagement processes, so this funding could support those processes as well. Admin costs are also eligible under the project to be funded, and we have had discussions about allowing pre-development costs, but we would like to have a conversation. We are going to have a letter of intent process and a pre-application meeting a part of this grant, so that would be definitely something we want to come in and have a discussion with each community of what the breakdown of what those costs would look like. Something that's really exciting about this program too, that was added at the last second, is that we're also funding off-site improvements. So you all come in and you've been trying to push an affordable housing project, and the community wants benefits that are added to the neighborhood, or is added to just not the residents of the future project, but to the existing residents. So this could fund parks, it could fund bike path improvements, it could we have a whole list on our guidelines, so I won't run through them all now. But we really want those funding for off-site improvements to focus on equity concerns. And we're expecting we'd probably award about 50% of the grant funding to off-site improvements. So we want really great projects to come out of this program, and so we do have a list of kind of what makes your project the most competitive, and our list can be found in our guidelines on the website as well. But just to go over it really quick, we want to see a wide breadth of geographic and housing type diversity. Readiness is a big thing we want to focus on. So these projects have been vetted, they have support, and they're ready to go because we do have a tight timeline with the 2024 deadline. Capacity to finish the project, to carry it through, the impact of the project on the community, sustained support, best practices, and community benefits. Also support sustainable housing development patterns, and also focus us on goals of equity, diversity, and inclusion. We also added into our guidelines that there are extra points that may be earned for an applicant who address the bottom 3 bullets, which would be rehabilitating vacant commercial or industrial buildings in the core area, higher energy efficiency than locally required, and ensured long-term affordability. So we're looking for that deeper affordability, de-restriction that is more than 30 years. So the timeline on this program is we posted the guidelines last week. We had a really great stakeholder engagement. Many of you probably in this room were a part of that engagement, and we thank you for adding your thoughts. And we feel really confident about the guidelines we've posted. However, we do know that this is a working document, and there's also a lot of things that are going to come up in the future that maybe we didn't cover in the guidelines. So what we're planning on doing is doing a small catalyst project round this year So these are for the projects. We've had communities come to us that say, hey, we need this funding now, like we needed it yesterday. And so we're looking to fund 3 to 5 model projects that will really be the catalyst projects around the state to show what good practices, best practices are for this, and to be kind of something to hold up as we move into the next big round next year. So applications for those will likely be due in December or January. Our timing's not exact yet on that, but what we will be doing is in November, we will be asking for a letter of intent process. So that will be just listing out what your project is, what you intend to accomplish, and then you'll actually set up a meeting with the DOLA team to discuss and kind of talk about viability of being a part of this round or maybe the next round. And the remaining funds will be available in mid to late 2022, so next summer, fall, we're hoping. And if you just Google DOLA 1271 or visit that website, both the planning grant information and the incentives grant information is all listed on there. And as Christy mentioned, we're constantly updating those FAQ documents. We'll also be adding a lot of more supplemental information about what we're looking for and what we kind of are upholding as best practices and engagement and project types and what else. So yeah, just key takeaways from the overview of these planning grant, this incentives grant and planning grant programs. So first one is evaluate whether you need to apply for a planning grant. Look at your zoning code, look at your development permitting fees and how your community goes around it, and see how many qualifying strategies you already have adopted. And also just take a look of, do you need to just take a pulse on how housing needs are being assessed in your community? Do you need to update your housing needs assessment, or just do one in general to help kind of group those the good intentions of the qualifying strategies together with your housing needs assessment. And then also start talking to your housing community about potential projects in the pipeline. Maybe you already have awareness of that, but also reach out to partners to apply along with, so you have extra support. And also think about how you will create your public engagement portion. That this is something we can't stress enough, that we will be looking for reporting on this and making sure that this is really led with equity in mind. And to reiterate, you can come in for funding for engagement work. So if that's been a hurdle in the past, that was something we want to support. And also think timing. This is a really fast process. We know that code updates take a long time. We know that building projects take a long time. So just come in intentions with knowing what's going to work best for your community and the future projects that you have. So thank you. Yeah, get Aaron. Aaron, that was you.
Oh, no,
No?
it's me.
Yeah.
I'm giving wrong information already. Okay. Thanks. All right, next we're going to talk a little bit about how to leverage funds. So we just heard about these programs and how we're trying to be flexible, and one of the points is, we'd love to try and create some flexibility in the match. And one of the things to be thinking about is, well, what does the Division of Housing have to offer? Might we consider that? So as I mentioned, just like the Division of Local Government, where we has our regional managers, Division of Housing has their regional team. And so these slides are courtesy of our colleague Spencer, who could not join us. So thank you in advance for your kindness for me covering this. What he sent us was an explanation of the Division of Housing, which, the lovely mission of helping Colorado communities and Coloradans secure some good housing. And a reminder that they do that through funding for operating and rental subsidies, funding to acquire or rehabilitate and construct affordable housing. They do technical assistance, and they have a regulatory role as well. So what he also sent are 3 quick case studies, so we can start thinking about how their programs may work for you. So we just set you up with some thoughts on the funding that's coming. And what I intend to do with these case studies is give you a few keywords that you can jot down and then go harass Spencer about, or whoever is the housing development specialist in your area. But he did offer to reach out and help you find that person if it's not him. So his email will be at the end of these few slides. Okay, so to get us thinking, we have a project in Breck, and this is a story of leveraging tourism to fund affordable housing. So this is focusing in on Summit County with the local designated funding source for affordable or workforce housing, had in the form of a 0.725 sales tax. It's comprised of a voter-approved local 5A sales tax of 0.125% that is effective in perpetuity, and then another one that was approved for a 10-year period. So that was a big piece of what made this project possible, and you can read the details here: an 80-unit affordable rental development, 1 to 3 bedroom units. And if you look at this little table on the upper right there, you can kind of see the funding sources there together. And it may be a little small, especially for those of you in the back, I apologize, but what I want to point out to you is to start thinking about, they've got energy tax credits listed, DOLA DLG's Renew grant, then there's the Breckenridge's match for the Renew grant, DOH is Division of Housing's CDBG grant, they used that one in there, and then they had a series of sort of local participatory things. They have a deferred developer fee, a permanent loan, a BREC loan, and some LIHTC. So there's one case study to be thinking about. Now we'll move and look at Basalt. This is a 27-unit affordable development, 2 and 3 and 4 bedroom homes. Strategies in this one is it's a story of partnerships. So this is where the Roaring Fork School District had land that was struggling to keep teachers who couldn't find housing. So they all came together and said, all right, we've got teachers leaving, we've got this land available, let's donate it and see what we can leverage. So what they've got here, and now the list is in the bottom right, they've got Habitat Restore, they've got a DOH grant, so they have the HDG and Home would be the key ones to take note of. They have Net Zero Investments, fee waiver from the town of Basalt. They had some private donations, and then Pickens County, Roaring Fork School District both made some donations. And then, of course, home buyer mortgages down at the bottom. So here's another way to think about it. I like this, a story of partnerships. And then the last one that I'll mention is from Gunnison. And all of these, actually, now that I say that, all of them really do have partnerships. That's pretty key, and will be key to applying to the programs that we talked about earlier as well. Okay, but moving on, Lazy K Housing in Gunnison. The strategies employed here included land banking. So this was a 15-acre property in Gunnison that was purchased by the city. And by the way, in these case studies, you may have been involved with this. If you have, please step in and share if you like. But in any event, a 15-acre property in Gunnison purchased by the city in 2015. So the city ended up committing 4.3 acres of that land to the development of affordable housing. So that was valued at $600,000. Then they also had local funds. The city contributed general funds to the project, and it waived a portion of its fees as well. The Gunnison Valley Housing Fund provided direct money to the project, and then the Regional Housing Authority provided capacity. So what they did was they came in and said that they would design and monitor all of the deed restrictions, determine homebuyer eligibility, and facilitate the purchase and sale of all of the 41 deed restricted homes. So truly another story of partnership as well. Okay, and so I hope you got some good program titles to go and look into, and there's Spencer's, well, at least his phone number listed there. But of course, all of our state email addresses are firstname.lastname@state.co.us. So let any of us know if you want to get in touch with some DOH folks, and we can get you connected. But for now, I'm going to turn it over to Erin to talk about Longmont.
Thanks, Casey. So my name's Erin Fosdick, and I'm a principal planner with the City of Longmont. And I should preface my remarks with I am not a housing planner. I work in long range, but I have been involved in the creation of our Inclusionary Housing Ordinance, as well as some of our code updates. So I'm happy to refer you to my colleagues in our Housing and Community Investment Division if you have specific questions about particularly our fee incentives, our fee-based incentives. I'll try to cover what I can today, but may have to refer you. And I'm happy and dismayed to see that I have a couple colleagues in the audience. I was hoping that no one from Longmont would be here because they'll keep me honest, but feel free to jump in if I mess something up. So wanted to just put this up quickly. I think DOLA really wanted to have someone working in a local government to really think about as you're considering either a planning grant or an incentives grant and looking at these qualifying strategies, what might that look like in a county or a city? Longmont has taken a look at this list, and we have several of these qualifying strategies. And so what I want to do is just provide a little context of how this looks in Longmont, how you might consider this for your local government, and just really get you thinking about what types of things you might pursue, how you might tweak what you already have, and just to really be sort of a resource to get the discussion going. So Longmont does have an inclusionary housing ordinance. We could do a whole session on our history with our IHO, but I will spare you the gory details of that. We had an inclusionary housing ordinance that was repealed. We spent some time without one, and then we adopted a new inclusionary housing ordinance in 2018. This ordinance in Longmont requires that 12% of all new residential units be affordable, and you can see our area median income limits are a little bit different than what DOLA is using, which, as I think was mentioned, you may have different limits in your community as well. But for us, affordable with a big A means for sale housing at 80% or lower of AMI and for rent at 50% or lower AMI. We are in Boulder County, so these income limits are relatively high. But as you can imagine, if you attended the keynote, we have a pretty serious affordability crisis. We're not Boulder, but even in Longmont. And so this is something that's been really important to our city council in thinking about how do we encourage affordable housing. One thing I won't talk a lot about, and I'd be interested, and maybe I'll participate in the Q&A and ask you guys about this. Our ordinance also looks at how do we provide incentives for middle tier or workforce housing, and that's been something that's a little bit new for us, so we don't have as much guidance on that in our ordinance, but that would be something that our community is pretty interested in as well. We require that affordable housing be deed restricted, and we require permanent affordability with our IHO. Developers have a lot of options to satisfy this requirement in Longmont, and you can see those here. So certainly, probably the two most common ways that people are going to satisfy this 12% requirement. I should mention that if you're doing extremely affordable, you can actually reduce that to 9%. So that is an option that we see, particularly with developers who are in the affordable housing business. So that's another option for folks. We are seeing on-site construction. We are seeing fee in lieu. And those are really the ways that a developer can come in through the development process and have their requirements satisfied administratively, meaning they don't need to go to council. That being said, we know that there's some really creative options out there, and we want it to be flexible, so we have some other options that folks can consider. That could be providing affordable housing at another location. We haven't seen this a ton, but we did see that previously under our other inclusionary housing ordinance. We obviously allow for land donation. We allow for folks to provide additional affordable housing on a project and then later redeem credits on another project. I don't know that we've seen that yet, but it is allowed. And then obviously we allow for a combination of any of these options. If you're gonna do something that's not fee in lieu for rental or on-site construction or fee in lieu for ownership housing, you need to go through a voluntary alternative agreement, and that goes to city council. And so that's something, frankly, that, for those of you that work in development, can create some additional challenges around timing and decision making, but is something that we are interested, again, in providing flexibility. When we passed the inclusionary housing ordinance back in 2018, we spent several years, frankly, talking with residents, affordable housing providers, and market rate developers to really think about what was going to work. You know, we went from having an ordinance to repealing an ordinance to considering an ordinance again, and that scared some people. So we wanted to pair our inclusionary housing ordinance with incentives to sort of offset what could be considered a hardship for folks. And so we allow affordable housing incentives for developments that are meeting this 12% affordable housing requirement on site. We're not allowing the incentive for folks that are paying the fee in lieu, but we are allowing it for folks that are doing essentially the bare minimum requirement on site. We have basically two kinds of incentives, and I'll talk just a little bit about those. We have financial incentives that are really administered by our Housing and Community Investment Division. And then we have development incentives that are really more of a planning type incentive, really more built environment incentives. I do want to note that some of our incentives require a greater percentage of affordability, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. So financial incentives really kind of come in really three categories. I only have two on the slide, but I'll tell you what the other one is. We do offer a number of fee waivers. And so that's based on a point system. We have projects that are scored and ranked, and then depending on what that overall score is, you can see they can get anywhere from a 20% to a 75% reduction in their fees, depending on if they're for sale, rent, and again, how they score. So these would be, your traditional impact fees, your park fees, rec fee, transportation fees, your building permit review fees. Those are the types of fees that we're able to waive. We also have fee offsets. And this is really, for other types of fees, we're able to offer a subsidy and offset those fees through our Affordable Housing Fund. And I'll tell you how we fund that here in just a second. But that would be subsidies for water and sewer development fees, your ECIF electric fees, windy gap surcharge fees, tap fees, things like that. We also have recently started allowing offsets for raw water. So in Longmont, folks are required to bring water with every project, which can be, depending on what the going rate is, it changes all the time, but it can be pretty substantial for some projects. And we were hearing from folks that for some people, this was a make or break. And so if someone is willing to provide 25% of their project as affordable, we are able to offset their raw water fees. Again, this is something that probably wouldn't apply to a market rate developer, but we might be able to work with one of our affordable housing providers on, and this is something that's newer. We also have recently adopted fee deferral. So that's something else that we heard as we were going through the creation of our IHO, is that it might be helpful for folks and might enable them to consider providing more affordable housing if they were able to defer some of their fees until a CO or certificate of occupancy was issued. We heard that that was really important, but in the 2 years that we've had that, we haven't actually seen that come to fruition. So people are still paying their fees at building permit, but that is something that we allow and something that you might consider in your community if that's something that would be helpful to the development community. Again, if you have questions on any of the financial incentives, I'm happy to connect you with my colleagues in housing, and they can talk more, provide you some information on how we score, how we fund these, and really what some of those numbers are. But we do have a fair number of folks that are taking advantage of these in Longmont. So just to pause for a second, since we are doing waivers and offsets, we're funding, particularly the offsets, we're funding that through our Affordable Housing Fund. And it's worth noting, because this might be something else that you consider in your community, is how might you create an affordable housing fund that can help fund some of these things and even potentially contribute to projects. In Longmont, we do that a number of ways. We have about $1 million that gets transferred from our general fund each year and goes into our affordable housing fund. We also chose to dedicate half of our revenue from marijuana sales tax. Longmont recently started allowing marijuana just retail establishments, and so half of all of that sales tax revenue, which is roughly about $150,000 per year, goes to the Affordable Housing Fund. We also are paying that back with revolving loans, which is about another $150,000 a year. And then finally, obviously, any of the fees that we're collecting from folks choosing to satisfy their requirement through fee in lieu is also going to that fund. And so, we do have a pretty substantial fund that is enabling us to offset some pretty significant fees. So getting back a little bit more into my comfort zone and talking more about the development incentives. Again, these are things that we've had on the books in some form for quite some time. But really, when we passed the IHO, we spent a lot of time with City Council and with our code consultant, Clarion, to take a look at our current incentives and think about what enhancements did we need to make, what was working well, what wasn't working well, and what else we might want to consider. So the incentives that we currently allow are up here on the screen. I'll kind of go through these. I do want to say that when we started this, we had a fifth incentive that was expedited development review. Interestingly, I know that was on your list of qualifying strategies. Interestingly, our city council chose to remove that as an incentive. And I say that's interesting because that was probably the most sought after incentive from the development community. But what we found is that for Longmont, it wasn't as effective as people thought it might be, primarily because we also had expedited review for priority economic development projects. We also had expedited review for, fill in the blank, other types of projects, and it became challenging for us. Everything became a priority, and therefore we were just trying to do everything quickly. In addition, we didn't control kind of the back end of the review process. So we would, Zach would work really hard to get his comments out in 2 weeks, and then we would sit for 6 months waiting for a resubmittal. And so the kind of the optics of that were that expedited review wasn't working. So I just want to throw that out there. Not that you shouldn't consider it, because I think the feedback that you'll get from the development community, and I should have asked, there probably are some developers in this room, would probably be that'd be something to consider. But I would just say really think through that and think about how you're going to structure that so that it continues to be meaningful as an incentive. So that's a little side note. So the current incentives that we're offering are height and density bonuses. So for folks that are providing 12% of their housing on site, they can get up to an additional story of building height. They can also get up to 20% additional density. We thought these were super attractive incentives when we put them in the code, and I think to some extent they are. But I will say that after we adopted these, we also updated an updated development code that allowed more height by right and removed maximum density in our mixed-use districts. And so another kind of cautionary tale here is when you're wanting to incent these types, greater building height, greater density, the types of things that as planners we really want to see, particularly in centers and corridors, think about how that's going to interplay with your affordable housing incentives, because we're not really seeing people take advantage of these in some areas because they don't need to, frankly. But we have had at least one project, a project that I'm working on now, that is in a mixed-use corridor that is going from our base 4 levels of building height to 5 levels, and they are providing on-site affordable housing, which is enabling them to do that. So that's good. We also allow a reduction in lot area and lot width. So for folks that are providing 12% of their required affordable housing on site, they are able to reduce lot width and lot area by 20%. And so that obviously ranges depending on the zoning district that you're in, but can be pretty substantial and can, frankly, create some more creative developments. And we have seen that proposed in at least one development. And then I would say probably our most favorite incentive is our parking reduction. And so in Longmont, we allow parking to be reduced to 1 space for every affordable unit. So while most of our development incentives apply to an entire project, parking is one that is specifically tied to the number of affordable units you're providing. So if you have a building that's 100 units and you're providing 30 of those as affordable, those 30 can each have one space per unit. The others will still need to be parked at what our residential parking requirements are. This is another one where citywide we're really talking about, are our parking requirements right? And so, that's not really a question for our affordable housing incentives, but I think similar to height and density, will have some implications as we go forward. If we adjust our residential parking requirements, will this continue to be a valuable incentive to potentially have people create affordable housing? And that, I think, remains to be seen. I also wanted to mention some of the other things that we've talked about, just to maybe get some juices flowing. I want to preface this with these have not all formally been discussed with City Council. They're not necessarily in process, but they are things that we've broached. We've certainly talked about as staff, and I'd definitely be interested to see if some of you are using these. I'll start sort of at the bottom because the top one's my favorite, so I'll start. One of the things we've talked about and heard from the development community is there a way we could relax design standards, residential or mixed-use design standards for projects that are providing on-site affordable housing? Frankly, as staff, we didn't find this to be a super attractive approach to incentives because we really want affordable housing to be the same as every other housing, high quality, good looking, compatible with existing neighborhoods. And so we think there's ways that we could do this that might be valuable to the development community, but we haven't spent a lot of time on this. So this is one that we will continue to take a look at, and one that we continue to hear from the development community that we should consider. Landscape standards, we have obviously a lot of goals around increasing our tree canopy and creating opportunities for green infrastructure. We have been asked if we could relax our landscape standards in exchange for providing affordable housing on site. This is something that we took to council, and there wasn't a lot of traction. It did not move forward, and I think the sentiment was, we had proposed maybe people could, if we don't want to reduce overall numbers, maybe we could allow them to do, smaller tree caliper sizes, smaller shrubs to kind of reduce the cost. And I think we had some folks in the community coming out and saying, we don't really support that. We don't want to see that. So again, another one that we might need to do a little bit more work on. Maybe some of you have done something that we could learn from, and I'd be interested in that. And then the last one that I'll sort of throw out that I think fits in really well with a couple of the sessions I attended yesterday was thinking about, as a way to incent affordable housing, could we allow an expansion of allowed housing types in our residential zoning districts? And so, in Longmont, we have our residential single-family zoning district that really permits single-family detached and accessory dwelling units and not much else. The thought was, could we allow potentially some of the middle housing types? Could we allow single-family attached housing if developers were willing to set aside a percentage of that as affordable? As you can imagine, that's a challenging conversation to have with the community. And so that's something that I think needs to be part of our broader conversation about how we increase housing diversity in addition to only affordable housing. But I think we have a few council members that are pretty interested in this. And so, this picture here is a picture from Longmont. It's a triplex that was built in an existing single-family neighborhood. I think fits in pretty well, and I think for those of us that are working in Longmont, we really see the ability to potentially consider this and think this could be a pretty valuable incentive. So maybe in a year or two we can come back and let you know how that's going and see if we've been successful with that. And then I'm sure there's lots of other ideas that we'll come forward with as we continue to work on this and continue to work with the development community. I'd be definitely interested if you guys have other ideas that I can bring back, and maybe we'll apply for a planning grant to study those. And with that, I will turn it back over to Casey.
All right. Audience members, I'm so excited because we are right on time. So now we're at the exciting Q&A portion, and we've been holding these FAQ and Q&A sessions, especially for the planning grant program, because as Christy mentioned, it's the first out the gate. And those have been wonderful in helping us sharpen the guidelines and think about our application, scoring criteria, and all that kind of stuff. And what we learned was that people have a lot of questions. So we tried to structure this to kind of reflect that and reserve a hefty amount of time to talk with you. So now is the time when we would like you to bring the heat and tell us what is going on in your community. What kind of projects might you want to come in for? Is what we laid out there working? All these kinds of questions. What have you seen that you're still unclear about? I guarantee if you're thinking it, someone else is wondering too. And to get your brain started, we have a little list of questions that we got through those sessions. So, as you're going into the grant, the first one is just a grant portal one. We'll have them called IHOP and IHOY. That's just the grant system. Don't be surprised if you're craving pancakes as you try to apply for these funds. What are DOLA's expectations for public and stakeholder engagement and equity assessments? So as Christy mentioned, we'll have more guidance coming soon, and we do encourage a portion of the award to be used toward that end. Can planning grants be used for studies? Yes, as long as they're attached to work towards a qualifying strategy. And can we commit or obligate funds but not spend them by this deadline you keep mentioning? No, all the funds must be spent by that deadline because of the statutory language. So with those to get your minds moving, we'll have a mic roaming around. Yes, oh, there we go. So please bring your questions and let's talk about what you think.
Thank you. So my question is related to the incentive grants, and as we heard from Aaron, water and the cost of water is increasingly a barrier to affordable housing development. And so I'm curious if the purchase of water rights themselves can be a use of those incentive funds. And then sort of a second part is whether water banking, similar to land banking, could be a use of that funding.
Thanks. I'm gonna make our resident land use and water planner come up and work on that one. And we'll just come up to the podium. Does that work for the panel?
My title is Land Use and Water Planner, so I guess I have to take this one. Yeah, that's a good question. That's not something that has come up thus far, and I think that would be a conversation we'd want to have. So if you look at the program guidelines for the incentives grant program, and you look at our scoring criteria, that kind of gives you a sense of what we'll be evaluating the projects on. So kind of two parts of that. One is impact on housing, and the other is affordability protection. So I'm going to create an analogy to land acquisition because it's in a similar vein, right, as like water banking. So the program can fund land acquisition, but we'd want to ensure that those two things, the impact on housing and the affordability protections, are satisfied. So what that means is, there will need to be a deed restriction so that we can ensure that any of this money is eventually, hopefully soon, going to actually build affordable units on that acquired parcel. So for the water banking idea, there would have to be some way to tie it to affordability protections. And I don't know what that looks like. Is there like a deed restriction, or maybe the local government is proposing, let's create a dedicated fund to help offset tap fees, and we will, that is one use of this fund. Like Aaron was mentioning, for Longmont's affordable fund, it can be used to cover horizontal infrastructure costs. So the tap fees and raw water costs are not, that dissimilar. So I think we would want to see it tied to a dedicated funding source, but we could talk about whether incentives grants could maybe seed that funding source. So how's that for a crystal clear answer? But I will say, Carrie mentioned we're going to have this LOI process for incentives grants, and these are exactly the types of conversations we want to have in those pre-application meetings, is to, get the local government staff, get our partners in the Division of Housing all in one room so we can start talking through these things and make sure that, you guys are being efficient, and we want to respect your time. We don't want you to take a bunch of time, go down the road of crafting an application that's not going to work. So that's why we're going to have this pre-app process. And really this first model round is kind of our tester of that process, and we're hoping that some of those creative questions come up. So, okay.
I've got kind of a two-part question. The first part, going back to the LOI, if you'd be able to explain kind of how far along you actually really need to be to submit for the incentives program. Are we talking really shovel-ready kind of projects, or a really pretty good sense of what wants to be done, et cetera? The other question in regards to the planning grant is, if you already do have at least 3 of those qualifying strategies, could a particular project be paired with the refinement or enhancement of those existing strategies as opposed to implementing new ones?
Great questions. Did everyone hear his questions, by the way? Okay. No, in the back. So I'll answer your second question first, which was about, can you come in for a planning grant to revisit or enhance qualifying strategies that you've already adopted? And my answer is an enthusiastic yes, please do. Because, we talk about being eligible for incentives grants and having those 3 things adopted. But to be honest, to be competitive, you're probably going to need to have more than that. depending on kind of the demand we see. So we are certainly encouraging communities to come in, maybe you put in an ADU ordinance 3 years ago and you'd like to revisit it to see if it's really making a difference. Maybe you'd like to revisit some of your fee programs. So yes, you can absolutely come in for tweaking of existing adopted strategies in the planning grant program, and we hope to see that. Your first question was more detail on the LOI and kind of what stage the project needs to be in. So the LOI is not done. The document has not been fully drafted yet. But I will say, in terms of what we'll be looking for, we'll probably be, we want to know a general description of your project idea. We're going to want to have an idea of your match, of your leveraging, what's your community support, are your elected officials showing support of this? So kind of a basic project picture so that we can have that pre-app conversation to make sure that going down this path is right. And another reason and why we wanted to have DOH provide slides is, this is a really excited grant program and all of us planning nerds are like, yes, land use, this is great. But this is really kind of a drop in the bucket of housing related stimulus funds that the state has received. And the Division of Housing and other agencies like CHAFA, they have also a lot of money. And so, this program's great, but it may not necessarily be the right fit for your project. So that's another benefit of those pre-app meetings, is getting some of other funding partners in the room to maybe, if it's appropriate, steer you towards a Division of Housing grant program or something like that. So I want to mention that. But your question related to kind of what stage the project needs to be at, it doesn't necessarily need to be shovel ready to submit an LOI. And because these funds are so flexible, which is great, it's one of the real benefits of the bill language, because we've heard a lot from communities in our stakeholder engagement process that, hey, this bill actually funds things that are really hard to fund with traditional affordable housing financing structures. Like, it can fund pre-development costs, it can fund horizontal infrastructure, it can fund those off-site improvement community benefit pieces that we know are really important to making a good project. So the LOI is not necessarily intended to evaluate the shovel readiness of a project, because maybe you're going to come in for land acquisition, and that's at a very different development stage than you need your final 500,000 gap financing, and then you can cut the ribbon, right? So the LOI is really more of, is this the right grant program for your project? Not necessarily how far your project is along. Does that make sense? Any other? Yeah.
Yeah, that was great. I would just add, for the sort of catalyst round, we will be looking for a little bit more shovel-ready projects. And then we are, speaking of all the other stimulus housing-related funding, we are almost done with a handout on what all those might be. So if that would be something of interest to you, a little like sort of two-pager, then please come approach us, because we have that listed out. And to also think about the timeline when you're thinking about how ready does the project need to be, because if you were to come in for the start of the larger round, which would be, again, sort of late next year, and the funds need to be spent by June 2024, just think about that timeline. Okay. Yeah. Oh.
We do definitely want to see all your project ideas and an LOI. Thank you. Because we want to show that there's demand. So even if you think it might not be quite ready, you might not have a project that can get done in time, one, we want to be able to help lead you to other funding that we have in DOLA and Division of Housing to fund your project when the time is ready. But also, we want to be able to show demand so we can try to get permanent funding for this. We have handouts over here if you guys want the handout on the grant programs. And also, we have a position posted on APA's website. We are looking for some help to run this program, so please go check that out. Thank you.
Oh, wonderful. Thanks, Andy.
Hi, great information. Thanks so much. Matching kind of question. Can this program be used with the planning grant? Can it be used to match energy impact funds or vice versa?
So, yes, and to start generally, we are trying to be flexible with matching funds for both programs. When it comes to within DOLA to DOLA match, that's where we wouldn't be counting that. Anything else?
Yeah, and I'll just add, because This is like the golden question that comes up a lot. Probably many of you are wondering about ARP funds and whether those can be used as match. We've heard that question a lot. So our financial wizards in DOLA are waiting for that final Treasury guidance, as I'm sure many of you are. It's looking like that ARP money can be used as match, and that there's some issues with like ARP to other federal match, but again, pending final Treasury guidance, it is appearing that your local ARP funds can be used as match as of right now, in case anyone was wondering that question on match. But yeah, DOLA to DOLA, because energy mineral impact is also a grant program within DOLA. We generally cannot accept other DOLA programs as match, unfortunately. But I will say again, if you have further questions about match, please reach out to your DOLA regional manager. That's who you would reach out to if you were, approaching another DOLA program like energy mineral impact, and they are going to be the ones that will really help advise us for any requests for match reduction or match waiver. So it's good to be friendly with them, and they're all lovely people. And if you don't know who your DOLA regional manager is, we can connect you with them, so please let us know. Is everyone ready for the reception? Yes.
Aaron prompted a whole bunch of thoughts and a couple questions for you. Was there a tie between your explanation of Longmont and these programs? I appreciated everything you said, but I didn't catch whether there was some relationship with that to this program.
Yeah, so we invited Aaron and Longmont to come speak because we just thought it would be helpful to have a local government perspective who's tried some of these strategies, lessons learned, what's been working, maybe what hasn't been working as well. But she was graciously accepting of this last minute, so there's not a direct relationship to like when the bill or when the program guidelines were being created or anything like that.
You might adopt some of what I talked about as qualifying strategies in your community. That's the extent of the time.
We mainly didn't want you to just have to listen to us for 45 minutes. Yeah, question in the back.
Couple of questions. So one of them is, I'm assuming that the grants that you provide is one project or one grant per application, right? Like one project per grant, if that makes sense. Or can we apply have multiple projects under one grant application? Yes, okay. And
Are you, sorry, just to clarify, are you talking about for the incentives grant program? Like for implementation money for a housing project?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Submit an LOI and then we'll talk about it in our pre-application meeting.
Okay.
Good question. Yeah, that's a good question. That, quite frankly, hasn't really come up because I guess my question back to you would be, are you delineating like, here's our main project, then we have this off-site community benefit? We would kind of lump that in as one. Or is it pre-development for two separate projects? That's kind of another story. So we would want to talk about that.
Okay, no, it was just out of curiosity. And then the other question is, if, let's say, we put in a budget and it's too high, can we amend that or does it get denied?
Great question. So again, we put in suggested maximums in both programs, and this is because we know it's really helpful for you all to have an idea of where you're landing and to see kind of what we're expecting. So certainly, for planning grants, if you come in at 250,000, it may be outside of what we say is expected, but we wouldn't consider that egregious. And for the planning or for incentives grants, as Carrie mentioned, we're anticipating this average award, but we wanted to provide room for larger awards because what if there is this really transformative model project that's leveraging all these different funding sources and it would make a huge impact in the community? We wanted to give ourselves room to maybe award, that $3, $4, $5 million. So there's not that hard cap. And I would say in terms of if we have more demand than we have funding for, I assume rather than straight denying applications, we would offer a reduced award amount than what you requested.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I did have a comment because I know that you had the list of landscaping designs and so forth as an incentive for low-income housing or for the
Was this for Longmont?
yes, Longmont. And so I kind of wanted to share a little bit what we did in Greeley. We updated the landscape code, and we actually encouraged a lot of the xeriscape. So having low water use plants and so forth is another type of incentive. They don't have to have lawn or anything like that, so long as they have 50% live material in the front. And what we say with single-family residencies is that anything that's visible from the public right-of-way or adjacent properties, then it needs to be landscaped. But if not, let's say it's a fenced-in yard, they really don't need to landscape that. So that's just one idea that we had.
Great, thank you for sharing. Just curiosity, did anyone attend our retrofitting your landscapes to reap water saving session yesterday? Someone's getting bonus points. 2 people? Yeah, we talked all about that. So if you're interested in maybe updating your landscaping standards, you know, with or without affordable housing, love to help you with that. And we certainly have resources, because that's something we're encouraging all communities to think about in relation to water efficiency. So thanks for bringing that up.
Question, for
Yes.
the incentives grant, is there any criteria on the amount of applications? In other words, does a town of 2,500 have to compete against 7 applications from Denver, 5 from Grand Junction, 4 from Pueblo?
Are you asking if there's a limit of how many applications per community?
Yep,
Okay.
because I imagine Denver, who has planning staff and other staff, will have the resources to put in for probably 20 to 30 of that million just by themselves.
Yeah, so we haven't talked with any communities that have indicated they're planning on submitting multiple. The bill does very clearly talk about geographic diversity. And so I wouldn't expect that we would award multiple grant applications per community, especially if we are seeing the demand that we think we're seeing. So I would, the scenario in which, you know, Denver gets 20 of the million would not meet the intent of the bill. That would be my response, yeah. Does that answer your question? Okay. Anything else to add? And with that, another nod to kind of both the flexibility of the match as well as this range for incentives grant awards is that we really want to see, again, that geographic diversity and diversity of project type. So we're understanding that these projects in smaller and rural communities can look very different, both financially and in terms of number of units. That's why our program guidelines are set up by housing impact with regards to the context of the local community. So a 7-unit project, you know, in Alamosa is not going up against a 100-unit project in Denver based on, will we have more units? We're really looking at the local context and what will the difference that it make in that community? What is the support for that project in that community? And we're trying to be very sensitive to those regional differences. And quite frankly, we trust the local governments to come to us with projects that they know will work for them. So. Okay. Anything else? You guys all need a beverage to start thinking of your questions. Can I just get a show of hands? How many folks are strongly considering or planning to come in for the planning grant program? Good number. How many folks are planning to come in for the incentives grant program? 2 hands up. Oh, there you go. Okay. Yeah, I would just say on the planning grant program, you know, I mentioned the first kind of deadline, if you will, the first rolling deadline is September 20th, and it's coming up quicker than we all are ready for, certainly me, I think. But if you all have questions as you're putting together your application, please feel free to reach out. We are really trying to be responsive on these because there is this push to spend the money, it's stimulus money, but we're also really wanting to show the need to the legislature, and we know that the demand and desire to do this work is out there with you all, and so we're really trying to help facilitate that. And if these programs don't work for you, then they don't work for anyone. So our job is to make sure that they work for you all at the local level and to help tell that story of this long-lasting kind of transformational change back to the legislature. And who knows, maybe they'll give us more money. Yeah.
And I just wanted to add, also keep an eye out for that housing toolkit program that will be coming. The Division of Housing is leading that, but we'll be supporting them. So just keep an eye as that begins to develop. And then, if you're not subscribed to our CDO listserv, consider doing that. We're going to be giving regular updates on this and many other things. But, some of the things that Andy mentioned, like the position that we have posted now or where we're at with FAQs and guideline development. Well, the guidelines are posted, but any big news will be coming through there. So keep an eye on your inbox for that. Sign up if you're not already. And as always, just approach us sort of as you see fit and as you need us. Did you want to say something too? No. Okay. I had a question, but oh, okay. Doing some Q&A already up here. All right. Any last burning questions before we get on out of here? Andy, yeah?
I'm sorry to do this again, but one more thought. After this initial round of incentive grants, it might give us, I think, Christy, you mentioned this a little bit, it might give us an opportunity to rethink some of the program guidelines the way they're written now. So please give us feedback now and in the future about what's working and not so we can make those adjustments. I think you mentioned, but I wanted to make sure.
Thanks. Great reminder. Yeah, we want to be hearing from you. Keep it iterative. Okay, well, we'll linger up here if you want to come up and ask anything else. But other than that, thank you for being such a great audience, and we'll see you later on.